Vägkardene hinjer bakom födkunningens rum jefrunon.
To our lecture on Beowulf. This initiates the medieval period and the Great Conversation. And this is, of course, the great fountainhead of English literature. It's written in Old English, which is already indicative there's kind of a mystery here, because when the Roman Empire fell in the West, most of the successor kingdoms developed what we call the Romance languages, Spanish, French, and so on. Here, the Germanic influence came in and displaced the original Latinate language, so that English is, of course, at root a Germanic language. The question I want to ask in relation to the poem itself, Beowulf, which is this stunning epic. It's not very long, but it is full of this uncanniness, which is, it shocks us out of our, I think, typical literary expectations. It is filled with monsters, of course, and it gets us to think about the conditions of civilization, which coincides with the story I have to tell in terms of the background. So how should we face the monsters who threaten order? It's something in the poem as a theme, and it's something that surrounds the poem as far as the history of its creation. The poem itself describes perhaps 6th century pre-migration Germanic culture, in particular Northern Germanic culture, or what we call Norse culture. The Romans saw beyond their borders, north and west, they saw two large groups, the Celts and the rest were the Germans. And these groups they comprise many different peoples. The Celts have a common, it's a language group where they're related, and the Germans have a common language group, which extends all the way up to the Scandinavians. So when the Germanic tribes, the barbarians, were pressing in on the Western Empire especially, as we were leading up to what we know now would be the sack of Rome in 410 by the Visigoths. In the years that were leading the late 300s, the early 400s, the Roman legions were pulled out of Britain. And that left them on their own. The Romano-Britons, that is the Romanized Celtic population, the original British were Celtic. They were left to their own devices. And in fact, it seems as if the legend of King Arthur would be dating to the time of this native Celtic resistance to what we call the advent of the Saxons, the Adventus Saxonum. Arthur would have been, and there's good historical evidence that there's some kind of basis to this, at around 500. In the end, Arthur, or whatever that defense, held somewhere down the middle of England. To the east, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes had their territories. And in that territory, that de-Romanized space, the people reverted back to polytheism, the Germanic form, the Norse gods. And literacy was lost because Christianity is what had guaranteed literacy. The clerics, the clerks were the literate ones, and without the Christian infrastructure, literacy collapsed. That was reversed when when Pope Gregory the Great sent the Benedictine Saint Augustine of Canterbury, which is not the same Augustine that we know of from the Confessions. He sent this Benedictine with a group of monks to re-evangelize the eastern part of Britain. And they took about a century. It is supposed that Tolkien, for instance, a great scholar of this literature, he supposes that Beowulf would have been written soon after the re-Christianization of the Anglo-Saxon part of England, and that would have been in the 700s. He supposes that because the pagan elements are so strong in the poem. I mean, it's the substance of the thing. It's clearly a Norse world. It's the Northern heroic age, the German heroic age. It's being sung here before Christianity, and there's this whole question about the worldview, which seems at times very bleak. Any of you who know, maybe not from the Marvel universe, but Loki and the stories about the other gods, and Ragnarok, it's a very dark kind of worldview. Well, you get a lot of that in Beowulf. After all, the initial predicament is that this great king, the great grandson of the first king that's mentioned in the poem, which is not Beowulf, he's not a king even at the beginning of the poem. Shield Shaving is, he has a line of great descendants leading up to Hrothgar, who builds this wonderful mead hall, Heorot, and the symbol of civilization in some sense, right, where he's carved out a space in the northern darkness for companionship, conviviality, for celebration of life, and then a monster comes in and wrecks it. And that's that question about what do we do with the efforts that we put in to try to civilize a space, pacify a space, to have humane interaction, and then something breaks in from the outside. Well, the irony, of course, is that the Angles and the Saxons themselves seemed like monsters to the Romano-British population that they came to. At first, it seems they were probably more peaceful migrations, and then it became that invasion that we know of in terms of the Adventus Saxonum. All right, so that Germanic warrior society that is described in the Norse ethos that's described in Beowulf is one that's founded around a heroic code. You've got an emphasis on loyalty of the war band, the comitatus, for the chief of the war band. The economy of this bond is plunder. The chief has to lead his men out to grab valuable things from other people. We would know this later as the way of the Viking, and give gifts to his retainers, his thanes, and that would be the way bonds were built up in this tribal society. The comitatus lived by the heroic code. The retainers of this warrior chieftain would rather die than to fail their leader, and if their leader were killed on the battlefield, the code would be that it's better for them to die on the battlefield with him. Okay, so there's this intense loyalty. But of course, we already see that this kind of gift giving is still dependent upon taking away the resources of other people. So to form the mead hall and its little circle of light, it's explicitly built on taking away some other person's circle of light. So this question about what is it monstrous and where we can locate that, is it something outside of ourselves or something we have to confront ourselves? That is something I think the poem is putting before us. Tolkien has this wonderful way of talking about the worldview that's encapsulated in Beowulf. He says, the monsters have been the foes of the gods, the captains of men, and within time the monsters would win. In the heroic siege and last defeat, men and gods alike have been imagined in the same host. Now the heroic figures, the men of old, heroes under heaven, remained and still fought on until defeat. For the monsters do not depart, whether the gods go or come. A Christian was and is still like his forefathers, a mortal hymned in a hostile world. So that's the question that we have with Christianity being raised here. If a Christian poet, and the poets of this world are called shopes, the bards of this age, it would have been presumably drawing off of the pre-literate oral traditions, as we know the familiar way of composing from the Iliad and the Odyssey. If it's a Christian poet who's taking these pagan stories, what do we think that poet was managing in his own heart and mind as far as the balance of the monsters and their ability to invade the realm of light that we've created. The poetry itself is very moving. It's different from the kind of prosody that is the meter structure of modern of English poetry in general, which is iambic pentameter, ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. The Old English, and of course the story of the language goes from Old English, Germanic, and then it's inflected through, of course, the Norman invasion of 1066, where then you get the Latinate through the French that William the Conqueror brings over. And that's why our language has such a rich vocabulary, because we're drawing off both German and Latin sources. But the Old English language, which is very distant from ours because of these changes that have gone on in history, it's based on stress plus alliteration. And so I'll read a little bit from the beginning. My Old English is rusty, but it's worthwhile to get some sense of the music. The first word is what, which is the way of saying listen. It's a way the shop would get everybody's attention. What we gardena in jardagum theod kuninga thrym gefrunan, hutha ethlingas elen fremadon, off shall shaving shadena threatum, monogum magthum, Meorod setla after el sode erlas sidan erst werth fash skaft funden. Hey thus frofre jabad, werks sunder wochnum, weorth mundum tha, off that him agwilch, thara umsitindra, offer hronrada, huran shoulder, Gomban Gildan, that was God Quilling. And the structure is generally, you have two stresses on either side of a caesura. So you have two phrasal units. Werks under Woknum, so you have the W sound. And it's either going to be the two shared, W in this case, and then it's going to match the first stress in the second half line. Werks under Woknum Weorth Mundum Tha. And the fourth beat is not going to be it's not going to be part of that alliterative. It's not going to match the others. So you have either 1 and 3 matching, or 1, 2, and 3 matching. 4 is different. And then the pattern will almost always vary. That is, the next time you're not going to have it on the first. You're not going to have the stresses in the same places. So it's very. It's full of variety. We can go to this one. This is important. This line. So, Shield Shaving was actually a foundling, an orphan, and he somehow rises by his strength to take away the mead halls from others and to terrorize those around him. And he was left a foundling. He knew how to make good out of this wax under the welkin, to grow strong under the heavens. He knew how to show his worth. All around him, tribes around him had to ofer hron rada. So that's whale road. That's one of those famous kennings. That is the compound words that are kind of riddling. Another thing that Old English is known for. And it gets you a sense of their kind of the poetic mindset of the Old English. Ofer hron rada. So that you got hron. So that first is going to match the first here, huran shoulder. And then you got in the last line, so over the whale road, all of those tribes around had to, should give him homage and pay tribute. Gomban Gildan, so that was God Kuning. That was a good king. And the emphasis is on the good. That was God Kuning. So you have this beautiful poetry that comes out of the pre-literate Norse world, and it's being drawn up into this Christian, newly Christianized society. Before I wrap this up, just one note as far as, it's very interesting because these are poems that presumably maybe were written in Suffolk, say. There seems to be the Sutton who ship burial surely looks like it puts us in the same world that is being sung here, and that is the people of the east of England would remember where they came from in Scandinavia. And this poem isn't about England, it's about Scandinavians. It's about Geats, who would have lived presumably in Sweden. That is, Beowulf is a Geat, and he sails to Hrothgar, the king of the Danes, so he crosses the water. And so the story is about things across the way, back before Angles and the Saxons came over from Scandinavia. So again, there's a way that the poem is trying to remember, to cross the ages, to keep that link with the past. And it's drawing off that music. And the poet, the bard, is doing what Heora is there for, right? To make a little circle of light in a world that is always threatened by death. The monsters always come in, the monsters of our own selfishness, the monsters of rapaciousness, the monsters of sickness and death. And why I think Beowulf will always just draw so deeply on parts of our soul that we can't completely rationalize. The monsters may seem silly if we look at it in the light of day, but if we feel what these monsters are doing, it's something about the struggles, both internal and external, how hard it is to make a world of light and communion and compassion and companionship. And the poem, the Christian poet of Beowulf, is never going to let go of that pagan sensitivity to tragedy and comedy performed over an abyss, because there's something that's always true about that. And so I hope as you read Beowulf, you will get moved in the same way, and we'll be able to ask ourselves, in light of the ethical question, how should we live? How can I sense the deepest rhythms of my existence, this world, in a way that makes it easier for me to face the monsters that come up internally and externally? How can I live in this world in a way where I can be a hero of light, creating a space of civilization in myself